So there was this period where Earth was basically run by giant armored fish with guillotine faces. And I'm not talking about some weird fever dream I had last night. I'm talking about actual history 400 million years ago, before dinosaurs were even a concept. The oceans belonged to something way worse. So here's the deal with the Devonian period. We're talking 419 million years ago, which is a number so big, it probably doesn't really mean anything to your brain. But just know it's before basically everything you've ever heard of. Earth at this point just looked completely wrong. The continents were in the wrong spots. North America and Europe were smashed together into this thing called Russia. Down south, you had Gondwana, which was basically when every southern continent decided to have a meeting and then never left. And in between all of that, ocean. Just ocean for days. Actually, at this time, 85% of the planet was ocean, which sounds nice until you realize that means there was barely any land. And the land that did exist was either swampy or desert. There was no in between. You either got wet dirt or dry dirt. Those were your options. The water was warm too. Everywhere, in fact, was. There were no ice caps. The whole planet was running hot because all of that ocean was holding heat and there was nothing to cool it down. Scientists love to use the word equable to describe this, which is just a fancy way of saying it was humid and gross and you would be sweating constantly. But here is where it gets interesting. The oceans weren't just big and warm, they were shallow. You had these massive shallow seas spreading over the continents, flooding everything. And shallow, warm water is where life starts to get weird. It's where things grow. It's where evolution decides to try out new ideas, which most of are horribly bad, but some of which stick around. And one of those ideas was Jaws. Before the Devonian, fish were just swimming around with their mouths stuck open. They were basically living vacuum cleaners. They would float near the bottom and suck up whatever tiny food particles that they could find. Really engaging, riveting stuff. It's a real apex predator energy. But then, and nobody's entirely sure how this actually happened, some fish developed hinges, movable parts. Suddenly you could open and close your mouth on purpose. You could bite down on things. And once you could bite, you could eat bigger food. And once you could eat bigger food, you could get bigger. And once you got bigger, you could eat even bigger food. See where this is going? So we've been talking about fish that have dominated through fear. And speaking of fear, this video's paid partner is BetterHelp. For most of my life, I was motivated by the fear of failure. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but for me, it worked out. I worked very hard to advance my career as high as I could, all because I was terrified of not making it. But the thing is, once I did see success, that fear didn't disappear. It just turned into burnout. I started therapy to figure out why I was burning out despite already succeeding in my eyes. And big shocker, but turns out when you run on anxiety for years, you don't develop a plan B for when that stops working. And that's why BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. You fill out a questionnaire and they connect you with a credentialed therapist who's trained to listen and give unbiased advice. If it's not the right fit, you can switch therapists at any time for no extra cost. The whole process really helped me find new reasons to care about my work beyond what if I'm just a failure, which, trust me, is way better than imagining yourself as a washed up creator living in a van. Hopefully that doesn't happen. So click the link in the description or the pinned comment or go to betterhelp.com/spinosnack to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Thank you so much to BetterHelp for partnering with us on this video. Now back to talking about scary fish. The Devonian is when this whole system got started. Jaws showed up and everything in the ocean immediately got reorganized. Fish that couldn't bite were now on the menu. Fish that could bite were doing the ordering. It was a complete shift in how the ocean worked. And it wasn't just one type of fish that figured this out. By the start of the Devonian, pretty much every major group of jawed fish had already appeared. You had the placoderms with their armor plating. You had early sharks with their cartilage skeletons. You had bony fish starting to branch out into what would eventually become most fish today. Everyone was trying out the jaw thing and seeing what worked. The old guard, the jawless armored fish, started declining pretty much immediately. It's hard to compete when your hunting strategy is to hover and hope, and everyone else can actively bite you. By the middle of the Devonian, jawless fish were on their way out. They weren't gone yet, but they were definitely circling the drain. Meanwhile, on land, something equally weird was happening. Plants were showing up. These were actual plants with roots and stems. Before this, land was mostly just rock and dirt and maybe some moss if you were lucky. But now you have these little pioneer plants figuring out how to survive out of the water. This matters because plants do this thing where they make oxygen and they pull carbon dioxide out of the air. So as more plants showed up, the atmosphere started changing. The air was getting different. The climate was shifting, and all of that was going to have consequences later, big ones, but we'll get to that. For now, the Devonian world was set, warm, shallow seas covering most of the planet, new forests started growing on the land, and in the water, jaws were the new technology that everyone was trying to master. Some fish were getting good at it. In fact, some fish were getting really good at it, and some fish were about to become the most dangerous things in the ocean. And those fish had names, and they were not messing around. Let's start with Dunkleosteus, because honestly, where else would you start? You all know Dunkleosteus, and honestly, it feels like it's been talked about enough, but it's so good at what it did that we have to talk about it. But don't worry, we're going to talk about some niche ones too. This thing was somewhere between 4 and 6 meters long, maybe even bigger. Scientists argue about this constantly because they can't agree on how to measure extinct fish apparently. But regardless of whether it was 4 meters or 6 meters or somewhere in between, it was a pretty damn big fish, and it was big enough to ruin your day if your day was happening in the Devonian Ocean. The first thing you need to know about Dunkleosteus is that it didn't have teeth, which sounds like good news until you find out what it had instead. Its jaws were just these sharp, bony blades, which were self-sharpening bony blades. Every time it bit down, the blades scraped together and stayed sharp. It was walking around with built-in guillotines for a face, and the bite force was genuinely unhinged. Scientists did the math on this, and Dunkleosteus could snap its jaws shut with enough force to cut through bone. They have found fossils of other armored fish with bite marks that match this perfectly, clean cuts straight through the armor, which is insane because that armor was thick. It was designed to stop bites, and Dunkleosteus just ignored that completely. It could open its mouth in 50 milliseconds. For reference, that is faster than you can blink. So if you were a fish and you saw Dunkleosteus, you were already food. There was no reaction time. It was just over. But what did it eat though? Well, everything. Other placoderms, sharks, giant sea scorpions that were trying to stay relevant, ammonoids, probably its own cousins if it was hungry enough. They have found partially digested fish inside Dunkleosteus fossils. This thing was not picky. It saw movement, it bit down, and then it figured out if it wanted to eat it or not. But Dunkleosteus wasn't the only placoderm around. There were hundreds of species, and most of them were small, but some of them were weird. Take both Rheolepis. This thing was about 30 centimeters long and spent its entire life dragging itself across the bottom eating mud, just scraping through sediment looking for anything edible. It had these weird arm fin things that it used to pull itself forward. Scientists think it might have even crawled out of the water sometimes, which is a deeply uncomfortable thought. A fish with arms leaving the ocean. Nobody asked for that. Then you had Titan Ichthyes, which was huge, but apparently decided violence wasn't its thing. It was the same size as Dunkleosteus with a similar body plan, but its jaws were thin and weak. It couldn't bite through anything. Scientists think it just swam around with its mouth open eating plankton. It was an armored giant that chose to be a filter feeder. It's a weird choice, but it worked for a while. And then there were the sharks. Early sharks. Primitive sharks. Sharks that were still figuring out what being a shark meant. Cladoslash was one of the first, and it was about 1.8 meters long, which is decent, but not huge. It was built for speed though. It had a streamlined body, a forked tail, and no heavy armor slowing it down. This thing could move. It ate smaller fish, probably some squid, and spent most of its time trying not to get eaten by Dunkleosteus. Then there was also Stethocanathus, which had this absolutely bizarre flat spike on its back. Scientists think the males use it during mating somehow. Nobody's really sure. It looked ridiculous, but the fish didn't seem to care. It was small, maybe a meter long, and it hunted little fish and crustaceans near the reef. So you had armored giants with guillotine jaws, you had bottom feeders with arm fins, and you had filter feeding tanks. And you had early sharks trying to carve out their niche while everything else was covered in armor. The ocean was full. Every spot was taken, every role was filled, and the whole system was about to get really organized. Having all of these creatures swimming around is one thing, but actually running the ocean is different. So Dunkleosteus had this jaw mechanism that was genuinely broken. Not broken as in it didn't work, but broken as in whoever designed this clearly wasn't thinking about playing fair. Again, when it opened its mouth, it created suction, strong suction, the kind that would pull prey towards it before the jaws even closed. So if you're a fish, you see Dunkleosteus, you try to swim away, and instead you get vacuumed directly into the guillotine. There was no winning that situation. Let's talk about about its bite force though, because its numbers are absurd. Estimates put it at around 6,000 to 7,400 newtons, which doesn't mean much until you compare it to a modern great white shark at about 18,000 newtons. So Dunkleosteus had about a third of a great white's bite force, but it was also using blades instead of teeth, blades that could concentrate force better. You didn't need as much pressure when you're cutting instead of crushing. What's more interesting though is that they've found evidence that Dunkleosteus threw up sometimes. There are fossils of regurgitated material near Dunkleosteus remains, which means it would eat something, realize that it couldn't actually eat it or didn't want to, and then just spit it back out. This is picky eater behavior from an apex predator, meaning that it could afford to be picky because there was always more food, aka this was the apex predator of its time. But here's the thing about being that big and armored. You're not fast. The armor plating was heavy. Dunkleosteus probably wasn't chasing down prey in open water. It was more of an ambush hunter. Sit still, wait for something to swim close, and then explode forward for one big strike. The suction helped with that. It didn't need to chase when it could just pull the prey in. And the armor wasn't just for protection, it was also storage. Calcium and phosphate, the stuff bones are made of, got stored in those plates. So Dunkleosteus was walking around with a mineral bank attached to its body. If it needed calcium, it could just pull it from the armor. It was efficient, but it also meant that you were stuck with all of that weight. Other predators in the Devonian had different strategies. Sharks were going for speed over defense. They had no heavy armor, just cartilage and muscle. Cladodesalash could probably outrun most things in the water, but if it ran into Dunkleosteus, speed didn't matter. The guillotine jaws didn't care how fast you were about 5 seconds ago. Smaller placoderms were filling different roles. Some were bottom feeders, some were crushing shellfish with specialized plates. Some were going after softer prey that didn't require the whole jaw blade situation. The ocean had enough room for different strategies, but absolutely Dunkleosteus was at the top because nothing was eating it. In fact, we have found no fossil evidence of anything successfully hunting adult Dunkleosteus, except for itself. It was the end of the food chain. Everything else was just somewhere lower on the list. The dominance lasted for about 60 million years, which is a very long time to be in charge. Humans have been around for maybe 300,000 years, and we're already worried about running out of stuff. Dunkleosteus had 60 million years of just doing whatever it wanted. Comparing our legacy to this big angry fish is on top. But it wasn't alone at the top. There were other large placoderms in different regions doing similar things. But Dunkleosteus terrilli, the species we talk about most, was specifically in the shallow seas that covered parts of North America. The Cleveland Shale in Ohio is where most of the good fossils come from. That area used to be underwater, and it was apparently full of these things. So you've got apex predators patrolling the seas, smaller predators trying to stay out of their way, and everything else just trying to survive long enough to reproduce. That was the Devonian Ocean, organized violence with some filter feeders mixed in. But a predator at the top doesn't exist in a vacuum, because there's a whole world underneath keeping the system running, and it was more complicated than just big fish eating smaller fish. That world had structure, and it was actually working pretty well. Because while Dunkleosteus was busy being the ocean's main problem, everything else had to figure out how to exist around it. The reefs were thriving. These were not modern coral reefs. They were Paleozoic reefs built by rugose and tabulate corals, which are different species, different structure, but the same basic idea. They were hard-bodied organisms building up layers of calcium carbonate and creating habitat for everything else. Stromatoporids were there too. These were weird sponge-like things that built massive reef structures. They are extinct now, so we don't have a perfect comparison for what they were doing, but they were clearly good at it because Devonian reefs were huge. And covering every surface of those reefs were brachiopods. They look sort of similar to clams, but they're not actually related. They're their own thing. And to the Devonian, they were everywhere. They were filter feeders, pulling tiny food particles out of the water. They were so common that a lot of Devonian rock is just compressed brachiopod shells. Trilobites were still crawling around too, though they were past their peak. They had been doing great for a couple 100 million years, but by the Devonian, they were declining. They were still present, still doing trilobite stuff, but they were not as diverse as they used to be. Some of them got pretty big though, bigger than earlier species. It was like last hurrah energy before their final extinction. Ammonoids had just shown up, and they were trying to figure out their whole deal. They were cephalopods, related to squids and octopuses, but with coiled shells. They would spend the next few 100 million years becoming extremely diverse and then going extinct and then coming back. But in the Devonian, they were new and still working out the basics. The food chain was also pretty organized. At the bottom, you had plankton, tiny organisms floating around making energy from sunlight or eating other tiny things. Then you had filter feeders pulling the plankton out of the water. Then you had smaller predators eating the filter feeders. Then medium predators eating the small predators. Then Dunkleosteus eating whatever it felt like that day. Everything was connected. Small fish ate crustaceans, bigger fish ate small fish, sharks ate medium fish, placoderms ate sharks. And when anything died, scavengers cleaned it up and bacteria broke down what was left. Nothing went to waste. The whole system recycled itself constantly. In the shallower water, you had different dynamics. More light meant more plant growth, which meant more small animals, which meant more predators. Deeper water had less going on, but was safer from some of the bigger hunters. Every depth had its own version of the food chain. Sea scorpions were even still trying to be relevant. These were eurypterids, and some of them were over 2 meters long, which was impressive in the Silurian period when they were the apex predators. But in the Devonian, fish had taken over. The eurypterids were getting pushed into marginal habitats, estuaries, brackish water, places where fish weren't as dominant. They were on their way out. And then there's what was happening on land, which is where things get interesting in a bad way, as we mentioned before. Because again, plants were spreading. Archaeopteris trees were growing 20 meters tall and forming actual forests. Before this, land was basically empty. Now it had trees, and trees do this thing where they suck carbon dioxide out of the air and make oxygen, which sounds great for anything that breathes oxygen, but it was changing the climate. More plants means less CO2 in the atmosphere. Less CO2 meant the planet was cooling down. There's a reason they call them greenhouse gases, and those tree roots were breaking down rocks, washing nutrients into the ocean. Those nutrients would cause algae blooms. The algae would then die and decay, and the decay process used up oxygen in the water. You see where this is heading. The Devonian ecosystem was working fine for now, but the plants on land were quietly setting up the worst extinction event the ocean had ever seen, because within about 20 million years, the whole thing fell apart. So yeah, the plants that we mentioned, turns out they are actually killers. They were a problem because less CO2 in the atmosphere means the planet cools down, which sounds manageable until you realize the entire ocean ecosystem was built for warm water. Everything in the Devonian evolved for tropical conditions, and now the temperature was dropping. There's geological evidence of glaciation starting in Gondwana. Ice. In a world that hadn't had ice caps for millions of years, the tropical species didn't know what to do with that information. The temperature thing was just the opening act. The real problem was what those tree roots were doing that we mentioned a bit ago. Roots break down rocks. That's how they get nutrients. And when you break down rocks, you release phosphorus and other nutrients into the water. A little bit of nutrient runoff is fine. It's normal even. It's actually really good for some plants. But this wasn't a little bit. This was every major river system on Pangaea suddenly dumping way more nutrients into the ocean than it could handle. Nutrients cause algae blooms. Algae loves nutrients. So you get these massive blooms of algae covering huge sections of the ocean. And then the algae dies. And when it dies, bacteria break it down, and that breakdown process uses oxygen. In fact, it uses a lot of oxygen. The water was getting anoxic, which means it had no oxygen in it. Fish need oxygen. Everything in the ocean needs oxygen except for some bacteria, and the bacteria were the ones using it all up. They found these black shale deposits from the late Devonian all over the world. Black shale often means stagnant, oxygen-poor water. It means things were dying and settling to the bottom without being eaten or decomposed properly. Basically, the ocean was suffocating. This happened in two major pulses. The first one was around 372 million years ago, the Kelwasser event. Nobody knows why it's called that, but it killed off a huge chunk of marine life. Reefs got hit hard. A lot of placoderm families went completely extinct. Trilobites took a massive hit. Things that had been fine for millions of years just suddenly weren't. And then things stabilized for a little bit. Not back to normal, but stable enough that some species recovered. Some new ones evolved to fill in the gaps, and the ocean was trying to reorganize itself. But then the second pulse hit, the Hagenberg event, around 359 million years ago, which was the end of the Devonian period, and this one finished the job for good. In fact, 75 of all species were gone, just gone. Not declining, not struggling, but completely extinct. The reefs completely collapsed. The coral and stromatopterids that had been building of reef systems for millions of years, they were done. Reefs would never recover to that level until the Mesozoic era, which was over 100 million years later. That's how badly this system broke. Placoderms got wiped out entirely. In fact, every single species did. Dunkleosteus, both Rheolepis, Titanichthys, all the small ones, all the weird specialized ones. The armored fish that had dominated the Devonian for 60 million years didn't make it to the Carboniferous. Not one. The last of the jawless armored fish went extinct too. So by the end of the Devonian, if you had armor and you were a fish, you were probably dead. Trilobites got absolutely destroyed. Most lineages vanished. Only a few groups survived, and they never really recovered their diversity. They would limp on for another 150 million years before going extinct for good in the Permian, but the Devonian extinction completely broke them. Euteriptids, the giant sea scorpions, were mostly gone too. A few survived, but they were done being important. Fish had already replaced them as predators, and now even those fish were dying. The Euteriptids just faded out. So what survived? Well, sharks survived. Not all of them, but enough. Cartilage skeletons, lighter bodies, maybe they could handle low oxygen better. Maybe they got lucky and lived in areas that didn't go anoxic. Maybe they made it through. Some bony fish survived. Early ray-fin fish that had been pretty rare in the Devonian suddenly had way less competition. The lobe-fin fish that were evolving into tetrapods survived too, probably because some of them could breathe air and weren't entirely dependent on water oxygen. And here is the weird part. Land life barely noticed. The forests were fine. The early tetrapods were fine. Arthropods on land kept doing their thing. This was almost entirely a marine extinction. The ocean got destroyed while land kept growing and thriving. The very thing that caused the extinction, the forests, were completely unaffected by it. They just kept spreading and making more oxygen and pulling out more CO2 and washing more nutrients into the ocean. It didn't matter to them that they had killed most of the fish. By 359 million years ago, the Devonian was over. The age of fish was done. Everything that had made the Devonian special was either extinct or barely hanging on. And the ocean was empty. It was just dead zones and survivors trying to figure out what came next. But what came next was different, and honestly, kind of better for everyone involved. The Carboniferous period started with an ocean that had been reset. Most of the dominant species were gone, which meant there were a lot of empty roles to fill. Sharks moved in and took over. They diversified fast. By the Carboniferous, sharks were trying out all kinds of weird body plans and sizes. Some got huge. Some stayed small and specialized, but they were the ones in charge now. The placoderms were gone, so sharks got their spot at the top. Ray-fin fish exploded in diversity. They had been pretty rare in the Devonian. They were kind of the background characters, but with most of the competition dead, they spread into every available niche. By the end of the Carboniferous, ray-fin fish were everywhere, and they still are. Most fish you see today are ray-fin fish. They won the long game. The reefs stayed dead for a long time. Again, it took over 100 million years for reef ecosystems to recover to Devonian levels. That is how badly the system collapsed. New types of corals eventually evolved and rebuilt the reefs, but it was a completely different group doing it. The old reef builders never came back. So, what is the lesson here? Dunkleosteus was the apex predator for 60 million years. It had the best weapons, the best armor, the best bite. It ran the ocean, and it went extinct anyways because the environment changed and the armor didn't help with suffocation. Being the biggest and the strongest doesn't make you safe. It just makes you specialized. And when the thing you're specialized for stops being useful, you're in trouble. The placoderms were built for a warm, oxygen-rich ocean with plenty of prey. When that ocean disappeared, their whole design stopped working. The armor that protected them became dead weight. The high metabolism that powered their hunting needed oxygen that wasn't there anymore. Meanwhile, sharks with their lighter skeletons and simpler body plans could adapt. They survived because they weren't as locked into one specific environment. But there is one thing that the Devonian gave us that stuck around: jaws. Every vertebrate with a jaw today traces back to those Devonian fish: sharks, bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, humans. All of us have jaws because some fish 400 million years ago figured out how to make their skull bones move. Dunkleosteus is gone. The placoderms are gone. The Devonian Ocean is gone, but the innovation that made them successful is still here. It's just being used by different animals in a different world. The age of fish ended, but the legacy didn't. Turns out that matters more than being the apex predator. Dunkleosteus ruled for 60 million years and then vanished. Jaws have been around for 400 million years, and they're still going strong. That's the actual winner. So in short, you can blame all of your dental problems on this big angry fish from hundreds of millions of years ago. Thanks, Dunkleosteus. I'll send you my dental bills. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to give it a like and comment down below what your favorite animal from the Devonian period is. And comment other dinosaurs that were found this year that you'd like me to talk about. If you don't want to miss any of our future uploads, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit the hype button to make sure this video gets seen by more people. And if you want to watch another one of my videos, you can click the video on screen now.